Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It is once again that time of the week. Oh, what time of the week is that? Well, if you have never listened to Wider on Wednesdays between 5 p.m. and 7 p.m., you might be unaware that this is the home of the Hoodrat Strategist radio program. This is a weekly political talk show where we talk about what's going on locally, nationally, what's going on in the activist scene, what's going on in politics, and primarily trying to dig underneath all of the dirt and talk about the stuff that the mainstream media is not talking about, and generally call out the establishment on its BS. And we start every week by saying the following thoughts, views, and opinions are not necessarily those of 89.1 FM WIDR Kalamazoo or Western Michigan University, no matter how dope or insightful they may be. So, once again, great to be on the air. We've been broadcasting over winter break, but I want to give a special shout out to all the students who are coming back. And what an eventful 2018 it has already been. We're not going to go into a great amount of depth in some of the big stories. I know Fire and Fury has been in the news a whole lot. I'll tell you what. Y'all want me to save you $20? All right. Trump is a moron, and everyone knows it. I'm sorry, I probably should have said spoiler alert, but you know that is the bulk of it. A lot of stuff, frankly, that if you've been paying any attention over the last about year and a half, 2 years actually, stuff you probably already know. Donald Trump. They talk about how Donald Trump didn't actually want to become president, and if you go back as far as the primary, kind of near the end of the primary, when we were all finding out, oh my goodness, he's actually going to get the nomination, that is Donald Trump. There was a great article written by his former campaign manager that basically spoke to the effect that his campaign began as a publicity stunt to promote his book. And as the snowball just kept picking up snow and rolling downhill and gaining momentum, Donald Trump's ego took over, and it looked like, oh my goodness, I might be able to pull this off and become president. And he became obsessed with the idea of getting that Burger King crown. And moving even beyond that, there was a sense like, it talks about in the book how he wasn't expecting to become president even up to the night of the election. And, it caught a lot of people by surprise, including myself. I thought, the Access Hollywood tape would be the thing that would, drive the stake in the heart of that particular campaign. I was already making kind of organizing plans as to how to deal with, a Hillary presidency versus a Trump one. Of course, what I really should have done, and in the days coming up to the election, I was getting a little bit more loud about this, but Greg Palast, who actually I'm going to be talking a little bit more about later in the show, great investigative reporter, put out a documentary called The Best Democracy Money Can Buy. I recommend anybody who wants to really get to the root of how Trump won in 2016, I'd highly recommend that book, because it zeroes in on the cross-check system, which effectively suppressed the votes of thousands and thousands and thousands of African-American and Latino voters. Actually, here in the state of Michigan, it was a margin of about 50,000 votes, I do believe, which, again, is greater than the margin of victory that Trump won in the state. So it was these kind of tactics that helped push him over the edge in some of the key swing states, where he ended up winning. Another thing that has kind of been underreported is, while everybody was going nuts about one particular thing that Steve Bannon said, which was talking about how Donald Trump Jr. was guilty of treason, and now it's kind of this palace intrigue thing where everybody's talking about, now he's getting fired from Breitbart, and there's this big estrangement between him and Donald Trump, and he was trying to make up to him and all this stuff. But more specifically, in the book, he talks about something a lot more interesting, in my opinion, which, again, didn't really get as much coverage as you'd think it would. But he said that, it's going to be all about money laundering. And for those of you who, haven't read the book or don't know exactly the context of this, let me read a little bit. This is an excerpt from a Common Dreams article that discusses this particular story. You realize where this is going. Bannon, who left the White House post in August to return to his role of chair of Breitbart, told author and journalist Michael Wolff, "This is all about money laundering." Referring to special counsel Robert Mueller's team of investigators, Bannon added, "Their path to Trump goes right through Paul Manafort, Don Jr., and Jared Kushner. It's as plain as the hair on your face. It goes through Deutsche Bank and all of that Kushner, I'll just say stuff, because Bannon is an expletive." Bannon continued, a remark made public amid reports that Mueller subpoenaed Deutsche Bank several months ago in an effort to examine the bank's ties to the Trump family. The Kushner stuff is greasy. They're going to go right through that. They're going to roll those guys up and say, play me or trade me. And just for a little context, thus far, 4 individuals, including Manafort and security advisor Michael Flynn, have been charged as a result of Mueller's investigation. So, again, using very colorful language, oddly enough, agreeing with a lot of the sentiments of what we've been talking about on the show. And you notice, like, the indictments that have been coming out of Mueller's investigation have had to do with kind of like these foreign exchanges, foreign deals, these not necessarily money laundering, but things not all too dissimilar to it. And we've also talked on the show that if Donald Trump himself gets pinned on anything, it's probably going to have to do with his connections with Russian oligarchs, with these kind of banking schemes that Steve Bannon is vaguely referring to. And not necessarily, we talk a lot about how, if the goal is to get Trump impeached, the grounds for that have already, he does an impeachable offense, like, constantly. Right as he got into the White House, he was already violating the emoluments clause. And if that's where you're looking for impeachment, this is probably where it's going to turn up. The main problem, and what we're really going to be seeing in the next couple months, whenever the Mueller investigation wraps up, is will that be enough to push the hand of the Republican-dominated Congress? Because, our own working theory here is, like, the reason that Trump hasn't been impeached yet, and this is backed up by, there was this great conversation with Robert Reich. He talked about speaking to a Republican colleague of his, and essentially they said, we're going to give Trump enough rope to get done everything we want, or as much of the GOP's agenda as they could. So they couldn't quite squeak through health care, but they did get the tax plan done. They're repealing net neutrality, although there has been a challenge to that. I'll talk about that in a little bit. Essentially, keep him around long enough to push through the juiciest bits of their agenda, and then kind of let him hang himself on his own rope. So why hasn't the Republican Congress seized on, not only emoluments, but also, his tweets about North Korea? That is an impeachable offense as well. See, there's enough there without tying Trump directly to Vladimir Putin, but they're not pushing forward on that. A few Democrats actually are, to their credit. But it seems to me that, at least as far as like kind of from a PR angle goes, they don't feel comfortable impeaching him on anything except actual like treason. If it's just money laundering, if it's just a violation of the Emoluments Clause, well, I don't know if y'all know this, but you know, Washington's pretty saturated with corruption, particularly moneyed corruption. And that might be a Pandora's box they don't necessarily want to open. If you impeach a president over his corrupt financial dealings, well, where's that going to lead? Because, frankly, and you know, this is not just speculation, but proven by both, you know, history and you know, the kind of scandals that come out of Washington constantly. A lot of sitting politicians have financial scandal on both sides of the aisle. So that might be a precedent they don't necessarily want to touch. But still, very interesting to hear that from somebody deep inside of Donald Trump's circle, that the campaign or Donald Trump, whatnot, might end up getting pinned down for something like money laundering. And again, it will be very interesting to see what turns up and what the reaction in Congress is going to be. Also wanted to mention, so another thing that happened over the holidays, actually just last week, skirted right past our kind of deadline. We do a show every Wednesday, and the next day, Mr. Jeff Sessions came out and essentially reversed an Obama-era rule that, you know, in layman's terms, means the federal government is not going to come in to states where marijuana has been legalized and prosecuted at a federal level. Because even in states that have legalized marijuana, it is still hypothetically possible to prosecute at the federal level because it still remains a federal crime. And Jeff Sessions, that is, has been getting pushback from both Democrats and Republicans in those states for, you know, essentially going against one, kind of where the wind is blowing. Even Trump himself, when he was campaigning, said just leave that up to the states. But of course, you know, Jeff Sessions is old school, and as he said, you know, good moral people don't smoke the marijuana. But I guess good moral people do get down with the KKK as long as they don't smoke that pot. So, at least according to Jeff Sessions, as it were. So there's been some pushback against that, and even like, you know, certain Republican senators like Rand Paul have been calling for Jeff Sessions' resignation, which is a good thing. I'd say like anybody who is conservative or Republican should be standing up quite vocally about this issue, as some of them are saying. You know, if you want to be taken seriously, you know, as somebody who stands up for your values, what are your Republicans always saying? States' rights, states' rights, states' rights. Well, it ain't right for the federal government to be coming in and telling you what to do with a plant that is legal in your state. I would press that even further and say it's not necessarily right for the federal government to come in and kidnap citizens who live in your state because they don't have documents. But, you know, we'll take our consensus with conservatives where we can find it. Of course, you know, another element of this is how mealy-mouthed a lot of Democrats have been on the issue. Chuck Schumer actually said that he hadn't really heard about Jeff Sessions' stance on marijuana. And then when pressed to ask if they're going to make that a campaign issue in like 2018, 2020, it's been a lot of hemming and hawing, saying, oh, it really depends on, you know, the state. And it's like, yeah, you know, without even talking about some of the issues with, you know, corruption and their ties to big money in the Democratic establishment, they are the most strategically boneheaded individuals I could possibly think of. Because, look, there are a lot of interests who are, who are against marijuana. The big pharma is decidedly against marijuana legalization. Actually, in the state, there's been a lot of push for synthetic marijuana as opposed to marijuana legalization. Of course, Am I Legalized has been on that as well. I don't know if that's going to be showing up on this year's ballot or not, but hopefully it does, because that could be a huge upsurge in getting non-traditional voters out to the polls. It's actually not a very controversial issue. There's a 538 article, which they do all of the kind of election statistics, and sometimes they're right, sometimes they're wrong. They most famously blew it on November 8th, election night, and of course also when Bernie Sanders had his big upset win in Michigan. But according to all of the major modern polling, most recent polling, unequivocally, most Americans are for the legalization of marijuana. About 76% of Democrats, 67% of independents, even 51% of Republicans are on board with legalized weed at this point. Yet, the Democratic establishment, the consultant class out of Washington, is not saying anything about it. To the credit of a lot of the candidates who are running in this race, most of them have stood up and said something about marijuana, about Jeff Sessions' move. I think pretty much 5 out of 6 are standing up loudly against Jeff Sessions' attack on recreational and medicinal weed. So we've got good things going on locally, but at the national level, again, the Democrats are being very dunder-headed and aren't really seizing this particular opportunity. Who doesn't? Well, I don't want to make any assumptions, but I would assume most people listening to this broadcast are probably down with the legalized marijuana, whether you're users or just people yourself. It's a pretty harmless drug, and particularly with the kind of alcohol problems that are had on college campuses, or say the college neighborhoods like Vine, Stewart, etc. Legalizing marijuana would be socially helpful as kind of an alternative to that. But of course, again, we're talking about why Democrats are mealy-mouthed on it and why some Republicans go against their whole states' right thing, is a lot of them get big money from big pharma and also big alcohol, like, Budweiser, Anheuser-Busch, because legalized marijuana is seen by those big alcohol corporations as competition to what they do. Which is why another reason to like microbreweries. They usually don't take stances against legalized weed. As a matter of fact, a lot of bars in, say, Colorado, particularly Denver, have been really soaking up the extra funds from people who are like, oh my God, we can go to a bar and smoke doobs, as it were. All right, so I think actually now would be a good time to take a little break. When we hop back in, I want to zone back into the Southwest Michigan area. Actually, Jeff Sessions is up to some shenanigans right here in the Southwest Michigan area. So you're listening to the Hoodrat Strategist radio program, only on 89.1 WIDR Kalamazoo, your only source for political revolution.
is a rather prominent issue amongst the student body of Western. The Invisible Need Project is a multifaceted initiative that's aimed to help struggling students. Every 2 weeks, generous people donate their food to the pantry located in the Fawn Student Service buildings or other drop-off locations. All you need to do is grab a reusable bag and grab whatever food you need to help sustain yourself. If anyone's unsure when their next meal will be, or if you have a little extra food you'd be willing to donate, the food pantry is your place. If you're looking to help donate, become a volunteer, or just learn more, call 269-387-4742 or email dosa-inp@wmich.edu for details.
Are you trying to get your local Kalamazoo business name out to the WMU and Greater Kalamazoo communities? Why not do so while supporting Radio Evolution through underwriting and donations? For more information, please visit widrfm.org.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is the Hoodrat Strategist radio program, only on 89.1 WIDR Kalamazoo, the only source for political revolution. So let's keep talking about everyone's favorite racist Keebler elf, Jeff Sessions. I wanted to read this article from MLive, and this has that kind of false neutrality type feel to it. So, like, the headline is, Jeff Sessions adds West Michigan prosecutor to fight violence. It should really be, Jeff Sessions sticks his racist butt into West Michigan and sends somebody to uphold and monitor his racist Jim Crow agenda in Southwest Michigan. So let me read from the article, and this is from the Grand Rapids area. The U.S. Attorney's Office in West Michigan is one of 27 nationwide that will add a prosecutor to fight violent crime. U.S. Attorney General Jeff Sessions says the new prosecutors, 40 in all, will focus exclusively on violent crime. Federal prosecutors already work with local, states, and federal law enforcement agencies with violent crime task forces in Grand Rapids, Kalamazoo, Muskegon, Battle Creek, Benton Harbor, and Lansing. The task forces are part of Protect Safe Neighborhoods and target crimes involving guns, gang activity, and drugs. Okay. Let me stop you there. So, okay, what do we got? Let's do a little bit of math here. So Jeff Sessions comes out real hard on marijuana day after our last show. Now he's sending prosecutors here to our area to tackle guns, gang activity, and drugs. All right, so why do I keep saying drugs like that? Well, as we're mostly all aware, I don't know if everyone listening is aware of this, but the war on drugs has been this sort of dog whistle code for rent-seeking and brutalizing non-white communities. And what I mean by that is, particularly under the Reagan and, Bush and Bush Jr. administrations. Oh, and the original Bill Clinton. Let's not forget that. When his administration did their whole 3 strikes policy geared towards selling and use of drugs. And also it was around that era where it was determined that, cocaine versus crack had a far more substantial potential punishment than cocaine. And that's not an accident, because cocaine was used more primarily by middle class, upper class white people, versus crack cocaine, which was mostly found in working class or impoverished black neighborhoods. So that's extremely dubious, especially focusing on gang activity. Where does gang activity happen? Primarily in working class, poor neighborhoods. And again, this is going to be like in the Southwest Michigan area. Now, how is this going to actually play out? Well, one would hope, we've got these cities in Southwest Michigan, kind of along different points along the political spectrum. Now, Kalamazoo, city of Kalamazoo, how much are they going to play into Jeff Sessions' agenda, which is basically trying to take us back to the 1980s when it comes to war on drugs enforcement, which again was both extremely oppressive and more or less a scheme to, get non-white people into prison for the use of free labor. I would recommend anybody who hasn't read it, The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander goes into this in great detail. But yeah, let's hone in here on Kalamazoo. How will it potentially play out here? Well, there's a couple things. Politically, our city always talks about being outspokenly progressive. Now, I've cited a lot in the last year about how that's not always the case. Our city's budget is currently run on this very trickle-down Reaganomics model, because it's kind of unique and first of its kind in the nation, where essentially we've got these tax cuts that disproportionately help the wealthy. I'm talking about the property tax cuts from the Foundation for Excellence, and makes our budget not dependent on taxes from citizens or particularly wealthy citizens, but on the donations and largesse of the city's local billionaire class. Of course, who's going to be running that Excellence Foundation is actually a fairly decent board, and we're going to be talking a little bit more about that in the weeks to come. It's not a bunch of cloak and dagger billionaire people in suits. The board of the Excellence Foundation actually has some pretty solid people on it. People from working class neighborhoods like the Edison and the North Side. People from the neighborhoods that could potentially be most affected by this. And, whereas I always get concerned when big money's at play, but also big money wants to make sure things stay palatable. Things do not curb themselves or, become a PR disaster, as it were. And what do I mean by that? Well, our Kalamazoo Public Safety Department, a few years ago, there was a study done, and our police department was found to be more institutionally racist than Ferguson, Missouri. To his credit, at the time, Police Chief Hadley said, we're not going to ignore this study. We're actually going to try to institute some policies about it. From what I have gained and gleaned, I used to have a bit more negative view of Hadley's handling of that situation. From what I've heard since then, his hands were tied in a lot of areas, but the measures they took, it was something. It wasn't quite effective enough. They made police partners. If issues were brought up, there were sensitivity trainings. There were they would have to partner up and actually try to go into the neighborhoods they went. Of course, that's to say we still have a lot of problems with local public safety. I know local activists who basically do cop watch type activities to make sure policing the police. Several months ago, we had a cop basically make like this shooting gesture at some kids on the north side, and a bit earlier than that, I believe it was about a year ago. They let the Kalamazoo Public Safety Department allowed a man to die in the back of their squad car. Basically, he was having an epileptic seizure, and the police didn't take it seriously. He was a black guy. I can't say, oh, well, the police there were certainly racist, but, I mean, there you go. So what we're basically left with when it comes to Kalamazoo Public Safety is a department that makes sure that it doesn't look bad, but still has a lot of problems. A lot of that same personnel that was working with Kalamazoo Public Safety at the time of that study is still there. I would gather like the ones who are most racist probably weren't swayed by 2 or 3 hour e-race course or whatever. So yeah, a lot of them would probably be more willing to work with Jeff Sessions than others. So I think it's going to take, particularly in this city of Kalamazoo, a vigilance, and especially we've got this new police chief in, and we'll have to see how she kind of runs the department. But I would say be extra vigilant. If you see something, say something. If you notice an uptick, if you live in, say, the Edison or the North Side neighborhoods, you see an uptick in police brutality, if you see an uptick in enforcement, particularly against lower class people and non-white folks, yeah, make some noise. Make some noise, because, again, there's some racism in the local police department, but there is also a lot of people in the administration of Kalamazoo Public Safety and of our local city and county governments who don't want that kind of visible oppression occurring in Kalamazoo. So I think we're going to go ahead and move on to another topic. And I want to talk, this is more of a national story, but it does relate to us locally. Because, a few weeks ago, I can't remember exactly when. It was one of Trump's really stupid tweets from either late last year or early this year. But he talked about how, like, oh, well, it's so cold, and everybody's worried about climate change and global warming. And a lot of you probably heard that and cringe, and you talked about the difference between weather and climate are very different. But I wanted to correlate that even more. No, it's not even just that weather is different than climate. It's that actually, like this cold snap we're experiencing is a result of climate change. It's not happening in spite of climate change. It is facilitated by it. So this is an article from Vice Motherboard, and it's freezing your don't know if I can say the ASS word, but freezing your butt off is also a symptom of climate change. Excuse me. So, I'll go ahead and read a little bit from the article. What about climate change? The fact that it is cold today in Palm Springs and warm in Juneau, Alaska is weather. Climate is long-term trends, years of weather. And one of those trends is increased extreme weather, including winters too warm to ski and winters too cold to go outside. Every winter, an extremely cool pool of air forms over the Arctic and is normally trapped in the polar vortex, a gigantic circular weather pattern around the North Pole. But the vortex is weakening, allowing the Arctic air pool to escape south when conditions are right. Researchers now believe it is the combination of a warmer Arctic and the loss of sea ice, along with a strong west coast ridge of high pressure, that allows the polar vortex to jailbreak. And if you're seeing like any of those weather patterns, it was almost like it just like when the floor collapses underneath you. So you'd see like those dark purples and blues of really cold weather, kind of up in northern Canada, up near the North Pole. And if you looked at a weather map during our cold snap, it's almost like the bottom fell out under it and it dipped deep down into the continental United States. And yeah, that's pretty much an apt visual representation of what was happening with the polar vortex. It escaped the polar vortex, and all of that super cold weather descended down into the mainland United States, including right here in Michigan. Back to the article. Climate change is heating up the Arctic far faster than anywhere else in the world. The ice covering the Arctic Ocean has shrunk rapidly. 50% of the summer ice extent disappeared in just the last 20 years. Without its ice cover, the Arctic Ocean is warming, especially under 24 hours of sunlight in summer. Warmer water means there is less ice even in winter when there is 24 hours of darkness. While it was record-breakingly cold on New Year's Eve in parts of eastern North America, the Arctic Ocean broke a different record with a whopping 1.35 million square kilometers less sea ice, an area the size of Texas, California, and Minnesota combined, than the 1981 to 2010 median. That's just in the last 20 years. And I don't know if I need to like scare y'all with just how rapid climate change is, but that's visceral. That's it. That's within my lifetime. I was born in 1987. But just to think like that much has melted in less than 30 years. Less than 30 years. 1981 to 2010. That's 29 years. And that's how much Arctic sea ice has melted. Researchers have now linked the loss of sea ice in the Arctic region, along with an increase in snow cover in northern Asia, to a weaker polar vortex. This allows the Arctic air pool to escape south into North America or Europe and Asia, they found. But this doesn't happen every winter. Last winter was the 7th warmest on record in the U.S. Turns out it takes, quote-unquote, two to tango, Jennifer Francis, a climate scientist at Rutgers, told the writer via email. When the Pacific Ocean is warm off the west coast of North America, as it is now, it strengthens a high-pressure ridge of air on the west coast. That's led to record-breaking heat from California to Alaska over the past few weeks. The east side, or downstream side of that high-pressure ridge, is also a lot stronger, almost acting like a vacuum, sucking the Arctic air pool south away from a weakened polar vortex. This scenario is believed to have been exacerbated the persistent warmth and drought in the western United States, along with cold spells in the east during the winters of 2013 to 2014 and 2014 to 2015 that were popularized as the ridiculously resilient ridge and polar vortex, Francis wrote in a new study. Martin has been tracking the size of the Arctic air pool during winter and discovered that it has started to shrink. This is also kind of pretty interesting. 4 of the 5 smallest cold pools on record have occurred since 2004, he found, which parallels the loss of Arctic ice and the increasing amounts of CO2 in the atmosphere from burning fossil fuels. My guess is that this year's pool will be smaller than last year, he said. That means there is less cold air to go around. So while it might be bitterly cold in the eastern U.S. right now, the northern hemisphere as a whole is about a degree Celsius warmer than normal, while the Arctic is 3.2 degrees Celsius warmer. So, yeah, that was just kind of an informative bit. If you got that conservative aunt and uncle that listens to too much, Fox News propaganda or something, there you go. You're going to explain it. Yeah, it is not only in spite of climate change that it's so cold, it is because of climate change that it is so cold. Of course, it's going to be warming up over the next couple days. It's going to get cold again. But, yeah, just next time somebody tries to correlate, climate with weather in front of you, just drop those truth bombs on them. All right, so let's go ahead and move on to another topic. And, this is actually a real brief thing. We'll talk about this real quick before 6 o'clock. I mentioned we'd be talking a little bit about Greg Palast, and I started the program by talking about his work. He's basically an election integrity detective. So he warned. This is a warning from his website. And for those of you who've been paying attention to Kris Kobach and his dastardly little election integrity commission, they've been trying to get voter rolls from every state. A lot of states have refused. There's some kind of a news item that a lot of people were celebrating because Trump shut down the Presidential Committee on Election Integrity, supposedly, due to this kind of lack of collusion, I guess, from various states. Now, one, I will say it is good that we have all these states who are refusing to fork over their voter rolls. That is a good thing, but as Greg Palast is about to point out, this might have been what Kris Kobach wanted all along. And again, want to give some context. Kris Kobach is the fellow who came up with the cross-check voter suppression system that helped Trump and lots of other down-ballot Republicans win the election by knocking primarily non-white voters off of the rolls. The way it works is to prevent supposed voter fraud, which is virtually non-existent in our elections. They will look at voter rolls from different states, and if there are two names that are too similar in nearby states, they get knocked off the voter rolls. And this disproportionately affects a lot of non-white voters because they'll be, what constitutes a similar name will be two people named Carlos Ramirez or two people named Tyrone Fisher, the data shows that it is primarily black folks and Hispanic folks, Latino folks, who are purged from the voter rolls in this case. So let's go ahead and read a little bit from Mr. Greg Palast's article, which he calls Kris Kobach's Brilliant Chess Move. Progressives are always looking for a victory. We saw this when most states claimed to reject Kris Kobach's request to turn their voter rolls. In fact, governors were lying. Mississippi and Louisiana, or too ignorant Virginia to know their states, have already given Kobach their voter rolls. New York Times and other Democratic Party megaphones declared victory when Trump shut down the Presidential Committee on Election Integrity and moved it to Homeland Security. Now, this is the important part. But this was Kobach's original plan. In January of last year, Kobach gave Trump a scheme to use the cloak of darkness provided by Homeland Security to do its dark magic on U.S. voter rolls. Specifically, Homeland Security could hunt for quote-unquote aliens. And by the way, if you ever watch a video of Kris Kobach, it's really gross. He doesn't refer to immigrants as immigrants or undocumented people or Mexicans or Hispanics. He uses the term aliens over again. You watch it and I'm like, oh, what are you talking about? E.T.? Well, hey, there was that revelation last year that government recognized UFOs. Maybe. Anyway. So yeah, just reeks. Kobach just reeks of xenophobia and racism. It is no accident that his system targets Hispanic and Latino and black folks. So going on, specifically, Homeland Security could hunt for aliens on the voter rolls, or as I like to call them, people, by matching the names of the deported, such as, for example, Jose Hernandez, with any Jose Hernandez on voter rolls in Arizona or any other swing state. Kobach's plan was not some panel with cameras and open record requests and meetings announced in the Federal Register. So once again, Kobach is ahead of the Democrats. His cross-check purge system elected Donald Trump, now adding in a bogus hunt for quote-unquote alien voters. He'll guarantee the GOP's lock on Congress in 2018. The New York Times ridicules the Kobach-Trump illegal voter hunt, dismissing it as laughable. Except that voter rolls have already been purged by more than 2 million. So who is laughing? Again, especially going into 2018, there's a couple of things to think about. And we talk a lot on the show about political strategy. We talk about how candidates who are really pitching themselves furthest left are getting the greatest election victories, even in, and really especially in, deep red areas where people on the left supposedly aren't supposed to win. So this is something people really need to pay attention to. If you're not a long-time listener of this, please do some research into election integrity, election fraud, and voter suppression, because it is going on strong here in Michigan and in other states. And if, 2018, a lot of people say is poised to be, the Democrats are going to sweep. The Democrats are going to sweep. Well, they ain't going to sweep crap if they're asleep to voter suppression, I mentioned this to many people. I actually had the privilege of meeting Keith Ellison at a meet and greet, and that was something I hammered. Is like, why aren't the Democrats talking about this more? Why aren't they talking about this? And, well, he didn't really give me a good answer, but yeah, if they're not going to pay attention, then it's up to the grassroots. We have got to put in the work to make sure that people's votes are counted. And this usually comes down to just actual, on the day of election day, having a support network, making sure people don't run into shenanigans. This worked pretty well in Alabama, because they were trying some voter suppression shenanigans on the voters of Alabama during the the Roy Moore, Doug Jones election. So people were reporting these in real time, and they squeaked by with just enough victory to get through. But that is what allows these ideologues or extreme personalities to get elected. Keep in mind, Roy Moore lost by less than a percentage point. So, granted, Doug Jones, his victory was attributable specifically to black women voters, which is the exact group constituency that is being targeted by Kris Kobach and his voting suppression shenanigans. Oh, and if you didn't hear earlier, I guess Joe Arpaio is going to be running for office again. So, yeah, stop voter suppression. Otherwise, he'll either be beaten by a centrist Democrat by less than a percentage point, or maybe a progressive will beat him by a more substantial margin. But either one, whether you're a centrist neoliberal or the most progressive whoever progressed, your chances of winning an election are in danger as long as we keep ignoring voter suppression. So I think it's about time. Well, let's go to a quick break. You are listening to the Hoodrat Strategist radio program only on 89.1 WIDR Kalamazoo, your only source for political revolution.
It went out on the radio.
Is that right? Well, we ain't got a radio.
Y'all ain't got a radio? No problem there, feller. Just go on that there internet and visit www.wirefm.org to hear a live stream of Radio Evolution.
Now, you know there ain't no such thing as evolution, Everett. And another thing, how's they supposed to hear this if they ain't got no radio?
Well, we ain't quite worked out all the minutiae of the plan yet, now have we?
Well, maybe we can drive around with a bullhorn yelling it at folks.
You mean kind of like this?
Where the handouts and you sleep out every night, where the boxcars all are empty.
WIDR is proud to be supported by Pedal Bicycle. Pedal Bicycle has 2 locations on 611 West Michigan Ave and 185 Romans Road. More information can be found at pedalbicycle.com.
You are now listening to our weekly RSO Spotlight.
Hi, I'm Alex Felice.
And I'm Kelly Coffee Tabby.
We are proud members of Sigma Kappa sorority.
We live our day-to-day values of loyalty, personal growth, friendship, and service.
We are the main benefactor for the Alzheimer's Association.
If you would like to learn more about Sigma Kappa's involvement in Greek life,
visit our website at wmish.sigmakappa.org
or follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Sigma Kappa WMU.
For more information on this week's RSO, you can visit westernherald.com, YBOT WMU on YouTube, or widerfm.org.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we'll be right back. I'm going to go use the little activist room, and then we will jump into some more palaver about what is going on in the world of politics and activism. Be right back. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. We are back. This is the Hoodrat Strategist radio program, only on 89.1 WIDR Kalamazoo. So, let's talk a little bit about something that's been going on one of the local Facebook pages. So we've talked a little bit about this on the show, so we've got a lot of congressional candidates vying for 2018. Actually, it's kind of unprecedented. In the 6th congressional district, there are 6 Democratic candidates running in the primary right now. Typically, they, according to a lot of people in the, 6th District Democratic Party, like they've historically had to find people and basically ask them or sometimes beg them to run. But as is happening all over the country, there's been a lot of enthusiasm to engage in politics since the orange one became president. So, one candidate, though, who joined the race last, although is kind of informally running several months before that, which is actually illegal, is this fellow named George Franklin. Now, if you haven't heard about George Franklin, let me tell you a little bit about him. George Franklin is a former Kellogg's lobbyist. Sorry, I say a lot. Lobbyist. Okay. A former Kellogg's lobbyist who, he, to his credit, has done some work with a couple of trade unions and with the African American community, but has also donated substantial amounts of money to, some Republicans like Fred Upton. Like when? In 2016. Let me repeat that. George Franklin, running to be the Democratic nominee here in the 6th District, has donated to Fred Upton in 2016. And, look, I've been doing this kind of work in the district for a while, a couple years now. I was working on Paul Clemence's campaign when he was running last time, also running again this time. Where is the excuse there? For a lot of his defenders, and I meet a few of them online, it's kind of hard to understand why people are backing George Franklin, unless they're like personal friends of his. But their defense is like, he's a lobbyist. He's supposed to throw money around like that. Okay, as someone who, first of all, corporate lobbyist. Even getting beyond his track record of donating to Republicans like Fred Upton, like John Pruce, like Tanya Shootmaker. He's also contributed to political action committees like Fund for a Republican Majority. He's also donated to Democrats, but corporate lobbyist. Let's be clear here. I, as an organizer and activist, before I really got involved locally, I put a lot of my time and energy into the money in politics movement. I was part of Democracy Spring, not anymore. That's kind of a long story for another day. But Democracy Spring, which was this march from Philadelphia to Washington, D.C., demanding legislation to, basically make for free and fair elections, talked about, constitutional amendment to, reverse Citizens United, and so on and so forth. Limit lobbying, that kind of thing. And so I marched 150 miles. I got arrested 3 times while I was in D.C. in that particular week of action, specifically to raise my voice and put my body on the line and say, I do not want money to be involved in politics. In part, I don't want lobbyists, corporate lobbyists like George Franklin, to be involved in politics and have the kind of pull that they do. Yet, he is running for Congress. And from a strategic perspective alone, that is, to quote like Jeff Goldblum, that is the worst idea in the long, sad history of bad ideas. Let me explain why. And, a lot of people have been kind of talking down to me. It's like, oh, it's a very red district. You're going to have to run a moderate, run a centrist. You know what? They ran a centrist, Doug Jones, in Alabama, which is a hell of a lot more conservative than the 6th congressional district. And he won by less than a point against a pedophile. However, wait, there's this woman named Danica Rome. There's this fellow named Lee Carter. And where did he win? Oh yeah, Carter won in Virginia. And where did Danica run? Well, she ran in. Oh, she also ran in Virginia. Now, is Virginia a blue state? Is where they ran? Were they particularly just uber progressive enclaves? No. They were conservative areas comparable to where we live. But Lee Carter was a member of the Democratic Socialist America. Danica Rome, a transgender woman who likes going to metal shows, former journalist, not a typical candidate for that area. She ran on a kitchen table campaign talking about the issues that affected her constituents, had a strong progressive platform, won and beat a politician who was actually responsible for the transgender bathroom bill. Lee Carter took out the Republican Speaker of the House in Virginia. If they can do that there by such good margins, then not only can we, but we must do that here. And running a centrist is such an asinine idea. That's what Fred Upton is, or at least what he purports to be. And, it's something, a strategist friend of mine named Don Ford put this very succinctly. If you're trying to say most of the voting population is moderate, well, you'd be right. That is, most of the people who still vote, which is not a lot of people. Keep in mind, a little bit more than half of people sat out the last election. If none of the above were a candidate in 2016, they would have won in a landslide. What these progressive candidates do is get independents, anti-establishment leftists, and even anti-establishment people on the right who can agree with them on certain things to get excited and actually go out and vote and believe in the system. Or not necessarily even the system, but just believe in the candidates. Oh, but we have to run a moderate Democrat. How is George Franklin's wrinkly lobbyist butt going to inspire people to go out to the polls? How? And, his platform is pretty centrist, too. Yeah, he's like a 90s Democrat. How is he going to excite people enough to go out and vote? And, we have Paul Clements, who, my strategic breakdown of his campaign, when I was campaigning for him, Did I say, did I try to tone down his progressive message? No. I honed in on it, and how did I get Republicans interested in voting for Paul Clements? I mentioned his stance against the TPP. Whereas George Franklin was on the ground floor in the 90s with programs like NAFTA. Like, he was part of Bill Clinton's Trade Advisory Board. And that was, NAFTA decimated unions. It screwed over rural workers right here in the 6th Congressional District. And let's just look at the license to 2016. Trump ran on trade. And, he didn't follow through on it at all, but that's what he ran on. And that's how he was able to get those margins, plus voter suppression, of course. But that's how he was able to get those margins. Who else did really well in this district who ran on trade? Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders won CD6, which is something that a lot of these George Franklin supporters are trying to get you to forget, I guess. Is that, hey, a progressive platform is actually really popular in the 6th Congressional District. And, again, they're taking the wrong... I've seen George Franklin supporters call Paul Clements an extremist. Are you kidding me? How can you take such a wrong lesson from the last election? I guess maybe if you weren't actually on the ground campaigning for Paul, you probably wouldn't know. You wouldn't know that, no, it was because he didn't push trade enough, and... a lot of the strategies he were using were in line with the kind of strategy that George Franklin would be using. He honed in on, identity issues. A lot of stuff revolved around, Planned Parenthood, trying to tie Fred Upton to Trumpism, which actually that would be a little bit more effective in this election cycle. But how could a candidate credibly do that if they supported the other candidate in the last election cycle? But anyway, so I bring up Franklin because his campaign, his supporters are really pushing hard on social media and being rather disingenuous. They are acting as though these financial contributions and this history is no big deal. And, I do have a few friends who actually support him. There's this really kick-butt organizer on the north side who does. But, again, you got to look beyond, you have to look beyond who you like, who your friend is. And you know what? I'll say George Franklin seems like a nice guy, but he has put his money directly towards people who vote for horrendous policies. I mean, don't make no mistake. George Franklin wasn't giving Fred Upton money in his moderate years. He was giving him money in 2014, 2016, when he pivoted at the behest of the Koch brothers to start voting radically on the right, especially on, environmental issues. Fred Upton is one of the top enemies of environmentalists because of his voting record. He didn't used to be like that, but in the last 6 years, he has been at the beck and call of the fossil fuel industry. George Franklin gave money to that. I feel like if you're going to give somebody money, you probably voted for Fred Upton. I don't know that for sure, but how are you going to give the Republican money and then vote for the Democrat? That don't make no sense. But even more than voting, donating money to a candidate's campaign makes you even more culpable, even more responsible for what happens when they are reelected. So as far as I'm concerned, George Franklin is partially responsible for the tax scam. He's partially responsible for the repeal on net neutrality. He's partially responsible for trying to dismantle our healthcare system. And, his responses to this have been extremely mealy-mouthed. He's talked about I donated at the behest of an advisor or something. Well, you know what? If you're trying to be my congressperson, I expect you to do a little bit more research than that. You're just going to fork over money because some advisor tells you to. And it's like, I donated money to some candidates in the last election cycle, but you're damn sure I looked up their platform up and down before I did it. The absolute best defense George Franklin could come up with is like, oh, I didn't know he'd be that bad, which is a terrible excuse and also not very believable. So if you go to the Pro-K-Zoo website, this has been coming up a lot, and I think like people have been saying exactly what's up. For me, like, I will not be voting for George Franklin. I will not be voting for George Franklin if he wins the primary. If he somehow, through a miracle of money muscle, wins, because I really don't see where he's going to get his swell of enthusiasm. Oh, he's endorsed by Jennifer Granholm and a bunch of establishment Michigan Democrats. I'm sure that'll play really well in the rural areas around here. And full disclosure, I am working on a candidate's campaign, Eponine Garrett, but I would vote for anybody else running. We've got some really strong candidates. Matt Longjohn is really pushing Medicare for all. He's got a really great track record. David Benak's got a really good platform, and he's got the Justice Democrats endorsement. Rich Eichels is a competent candidate. No, nothing against Rich. It's just he's got a good platform, not as strong as some of the other ones, but I would still vote for him. Paul Clements, again, like, his platform was really solid last time. I think with the right strategy, he could maybe pull something off. I am kind of wondering why he's not letting somebody else have a turn, as it were. But again, all 5 of those candidates, I would have no problem voting for. A couple of them, I might even do some volunteer work for and try to get out the vote for him. But George Franklin, hell no. Wait until 2020. If George Franklin wins the primary, I hope he loses the general, so that we can actually get a real leftist progressive in 2020. You got to think beyond one election cycle, and the worst that we're going to get is more of the same with Fred Upton. But if George Franklin, the worst thing that happened in my mind, George Franklin wins the election, and we're stuck with basically another moderate Republican. And who's going to primary him? The Democrats might be so happy to get somebody in that they're not, they're going to kind of shun anybody who tries to primary George Franklin in the future. And then it also would give opportunity in 2020 and beyond for a populist Republican to run a credible campaign against him, because what those conservative independents and poor working class Republicans in the 6th congressional district hate. Do you know what they hate? And I have talked to a whole lot of them. They hate corporate lobbyists. They hate establishment politicians. And that's exactly what George Franklin would be. So it would invite a Trumpite, somebody worse than Fred Upton, to win and beat George Franklin in the future. So, George Franklin, he's done some good work in his private life, but he's given his money to some really bad politicians, really bad people. He's too much in the middle. He's a corporatist. He is not right for this district. And I will say that again and again. And I will, I'm pretty low key on social media, but whenever I hear somebody bring up George Franklin, I'm like, okay, get my keyboard out, I'm going to war. Da 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 da. Tick tick tick. So, yeah, again, the primary is not until August 7th. And look up the other candidates. Eponine Garrett, there's Matt Longjohn, there's David Benak, there's Rich Eichels, there's Paul Clements. I would say you could count Matt, Eponine, David, and Paul as like progressive Democrats. Rich, I'm not really sure. He's a good, capable politician, and I would trust him with his district. But yeah, look them up. Research. But those are my 2 cents about George Franklin right there. And God, I hope he doesn't win. Anyone else, but no. Just no. All right. So, again, and if you want to see some of the discussion on this, it is over on the Pro KZoo community discussion page. And I'll say if you're looking to find out more with kind of what the environment of kind of mainstream activism is in Kalamazoo, Pro KZoo's a resource. I do think they sometimes vie a little bit too close to the center. Some of their constituents are kind of just more like, oh, the nice white liberal types, but they do some good work. If you want to see like some more people talking about the congressional candidates, there's 2 threads on there where they really go in depth, which actually a lot of people are kind of calling them out too, because Pro KZoo is not really the place to just be promoting candidates. Candidates should post stuff there, especially if they got events coming up that are related to important issues, such as I know like both Eponine has hosted some tax rallies, so is Banak. Matt Longjohn was hosting some events related to net neutrality. I think that stuff is definitely kosher to be on Pro KZoo, but you shouldn't just be promoting a candidate on what is ostensibly an activist local activism discussion page. Activists know who you are. I mean, these are the people who keyed into the politics of the community. They'll figure out who they're going to vote for. So that's where we are at with the congressional race. And again, look them all up. All right, we're going to take a quick break. This is the Hoodrat Strategist radio program, only on 89.1 WIDR Kalamazoo, your only source for political revolution.
WIDR would like to remind you to please drive safely. Drunk driving not only puts your life in danger, but the lives of others as well. If you find yourself stranded somewhere, consider calling Drive Safe Kalamazoo, phoning a friend, or having an Uber pick you up. Thank you for listening.
WIDR FM is supported in part by local Kalamazoo and Greater West Michigan businesses like yours. If you are interested in getting your business's name on the air while supporting Radio Evolution, please visit widerfm.org for underwriting packages and other support options.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. We are back. This is the Hoodrat Strategist radio program, only on 89.1 WIDR Kalamazoo. So, I wanted to close out the show today. It's going to be a little bit more personal than usual. Of course, it's also political. When is it not, really? And I do want to warn everybody, there's going to, kind of trigger warning. This is going to involve some discussion of, abuse and harassment. And really about taking personal accountability. And I especially want to talk about this for any men who are listening. I'll start a little bit about the Me Too movement has been about trying to raise the bar for cultural accountability. What we allow as far as these kind of toxic masculine behaviors. And there was something that struck me a few weeks ago. I was at this lecture. And no offense against the World Socialist website. They do a lot of great work, but the lecturer there was ostensibly from it, and was painting the Me Too movement in terms of like how it could be co-opted into a witch hunt, which I think the irony of using that language was kind of lost on them. But one of the attendees asked a question. And it kind of boiled down, and I'm going to be paraphrasing. All men, I'm sure, have incidents or behavior in our past that we would not want aired into the public square. Would we want these incidents to be used against us? Problem is, that's the wrong question. We defer our responsibility when we are not active and transparent with our pasts, with how we address that past. It avoids the critical work of examining the behavior, the internal biases, and the proactive self-determination that is necessary to not only transform ourselves, but address this shift in our culture in a way that's actually productive. And when we talk about like avoiding addressing our toxic behavior in a direct way, men, and particularly men who consider themselves allies, they do this as a matter of course. And that's particularly insidious because not only are we kind of lying to everyone around us about how we are the perfect archetype. This is the woke male that it's supposed to be. But a lot of men end up basically manipulating themselves. I'm a good guy. I had good intentions, or I didn't mean to hurt this person. And that's what we think. Or, we look at our behavior as this aberration. And it's the virtue of our intentions. It's this attachment to the narrative that this behavior is somehow outside of who we are as a people. Like somebody temporarily possessed you, and that wasn't you. Well, it was. But instead of doing the real work, we shun the mirror. We run outside with a pink hat and we shout about how women's rights are human rights. And we see ourselves as a champion of women's issues while treating women's spaces and bodies as an entitlement. And I'm going to hit on entitlement later on in more detail, but we kind of we substitute that work with virtue currency. And what that means is kind of what I was just talking about. You go out to the marches, you do some work against domestic violence, but it also means that your place in these spaces is not genuine. It's not so much based on solidarity as it is this kind of religious sense of atonement. And let me kind of cut to a point of why am I bringing this up on this episode of the show. I've had this article sitting on my laptop for a couple weeks now, where I was going to discuss some of my toxic and problematic behavior in the past. But I was a coward. I let it sit. Because just like that guy at the lecture, there's things in my past I don't want people knowing about. But that's a cop-out. That is not holding yourself accountable. And not everybody needs to broadcast or try to atone for the sins on a live radio broadcast. But we do need to, everyone needs to understand the history of their behavior. And I was called out on something really horrible that I did several years ago. And my deepest shame, one of my deepest shames about it is that I waited too long before I could talk about it. Now I'm talking about it as a response to being called out. We need to call ourselves out. What specifically, and I'm going to tell, these are 3 incidents, and there's some connective tissue between all of them that's really important for me to wrangle back into this discussion of how men, especially like white cis men, are supposed to approach this kind of work. Several years ago, I think about 6 years ago, there was a young woman, a friend of mine, who had just broken up with her boyfriend, and I really liked her, and I pushed. I pushed her, like we went on like at a date, and I invited over, and I kept pushing for something more substantial, and she was on, didn't really want to go down that path, and I used my feelings and my loneliness as this kind of manipulative wedge, and I threw this party at my house, and I'd been pressuring her. It's like, oh well, just if we could spend the night and just kind of we can figure it out from there. And she didn't, and I threw a little tantrum after everyone left, and a few days later, I came over to her apartment to talk. And it was probably the ugliest and most despicable thing that I ever done, because I went in there in this very calculated and calm voice, basically just setting out to make them feel as bad as I possibly could. And I planned it. I knew exactly what I was going to say that could hurt this person the most, and I said it. And again, oh, this isn't how I usually am. I didn't talk about it afterwards. And there's this kind of weird silence around the issue that I perpetuated. And I think I also want to mention, as this has gotten brought back up, this person also said that I threw a plate at them. at some point, and honestly, I don't remember doing it. And I originally dismissed it, and then I remembered. But if I could bury this in my memory, the way that I have, I could very well be misremembering those events, it's unacceptable, especially as I remember and look back on that event, and when I really came to totality and honesty around it, I always told myself, well, I've never physically done anything. Well, maybe I did. Which again, one of the things I really want to hit on is that assault and harassment are not just catcalls and slapping people around. And we need to broaden those definitions, because when we talk about entitlement, that's where we're at. I had an earlier incident, this was about 8 years ago, where I was dating someone and we broke up. And I kept kind of just needling and I actually looked at some of the messages earlier today, and it made me want to vomit. I just kept needling her about, like, oh, well, are we still together? Are we still doing it? And I had this gift, this Christmas gift, sitting around for her. Things that would not be appropriate to give to someone who was not your girlfriend. And one day I just gave it to her anyway, because, I wanted it out of my sight. It's melodramatic 22-year-old. And not only is that incredibly creepy and just a horrible thing to do, but I put myself in deliberate cognitive dissonance. I was like, it's okay. And it's like, I'm open about this kind of stuff. And it's like, why is you gotta be creepy? Oh, yeah. Completely divorced intent from impact. And this is something I've heard a lot from some of my fellow activists in the community. Impact over intent. And, what was the fallout from these events? Is I promised myself I would never do anything like this again. Like these were toxic and dark and horrible things for me to do. And I didn't. But the problem was, much like we talk about on this show, these incidents, there's a root cause to these behaviors. And if you don't attack it by the roots, then it's just going to crop up again. And I just want to round this out. One last thing, and this was far more recent. These other two things I described, these are like early 20s. This was in 2016, and it affected my activist work. Excuse me. I was going to this conference, and there's somebody I met who we were working on this project together. And leading up to this conference, I was erratic, and my actual behavior was very threatening and disconcerting, and again, entitled. I remember one night I knocked at her hotel room at 2:00 in the morning, see if I could sleep on her floor. I came to her hotel room while she was in the shower. At one point, I invited people to her room for a meeting against her wishes, and when she objected, I had this outburst. I yelled. I called her excuse stupid. And when she pointed out how unstable I was being, I accused her of gaslighting me. And worst of all, when I came to really checking my own behavior on this and reflecting on it, I apologized and I understood what I'd done wrong. But I kept trying to force professional reconciliation because I felt entitled to forgiveness. I felt entitled to being able to behave in a toxic manner and it just kind of going away and everything returning to normal. Of course, this colleague before this conference didn't know me from Adam. She didn't owe me any second chances, and neither did either of these other folks. And I again kept forcing it, and acting in a way that I am profoundly and deeply embarrassed about. And all of these three things I described, these are like some of the greatest regrets I have ever had in my life. And it's been difficult to, again, like this article has been sitting on my laptop. I haven't put it out. I'm talking about it now. And, I think, most men, including myself, they are way more terrified of their own history, that their own incidents will destroy them in the eyes of others, than what it could mean for themselves and the larger movement to actually come to terms with it. It's easy to brush away the ugly parts of our past, to try to accumulate, virtue credits. I went to the Women's March. I post about Me Too all the time. I went to Standing Rock. We talk a lot about finding the root cause. And, I've been thinking a lot about this over the last days. What connects all of those incidents was entitlement. That I can engage in this horrible behavior, promise myself not to do it again, and then wipe it away. But would the second and third incident have happened if I'd actually done the work of self-critique when I needed to do it? When I gave that ex-girlfriend that really inappropriate gift? Would it have gone beyond just simply vowing, I'm never going to do these specific behaviors again? Because there are internal biases, there's judgments, there's self-delusion involved in that blinded me from those incidents, and how they were part of my own toxic masculinity. I want to kind of close this out by saying, this is a college radio station. There's a lot of young men listening out there. Hold yourselves accountable. Don't wait for someone to call you out on it in Facebook to finally push yourself to do it, because that was cowardly. I was acting very cowardly. That's what it took. Somebody to, call me out on Facebook. And do the work of self-analysis. Learn from your mistakes. And in the scheme of our greater activism, that's the only way that we are going to be useful. We can't just be in this because we want to accumulate virtue credits or we want to atone. We have to be here and be working on this stuff because we realize that we've been part of the problem. I've been part of the problem. I've perpetuated this. And it's not just catcalls. It's not just sexual assault. It is the entitlement that comes from being a man, especially a white man. We have to look at the systemic, the roots, the causes of our behavior, because otherwise we're just going to keep doing it again, and it's just going to lead to self-destruction. And without it, we are just playing ally theater. And, I think men are genuinely terrified on a subconscious level, because if women dealt with men and the sins of mankind in a way that men understand, well, half the world's population would probably wake up tomorrow to their throats being slit, if I'm going to be completely honest. But that's not how we should deal with that now. Men need to call themselves out and understand their behavior and do better and not be afraid of the social fallout of what will happen if everybody finds out that you've been part of the problem. And it shouldn't matter. You know what? I could lose every friend I have in this community. But as long as I have the capacity to do the work in this movement, that is what's important. That's what that's what this movement actually needs. I'm going to go ahead and wrap up. And if you've been watching Facebook Live, thanks. I don't. Okay, well, I'm going to finish that out. So, well, that was pretty staggering. Again, I want to thank y'all for listening. If you didn't catch the warning at the beginning of that subject, I deeply apologize if anything I said was triggering or offensive. But you know, this is something we need to do. And again, if you're a dude or somebody who's just engaged in these toxic behaviors, you got to hold yourself accountable. You got to self-critique, self-analyze. Just moving along, being an ally, and pretending you never did anything bad, that's not going to work. So anyway, this has been the Hoodrat Strategist radio program, only on 89.1 WIDR Kalamazoo. We are here every Wednesday. We upload our shows onto YouTube. I'll be trying to upload this later tonight. And again, thank y'all for tuning in. Y'all have a good night. Keep fighting for that revolution solution.